Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, as always, for joining us here on The Avid Reader. It's a pleasure having you, and it's been a pleasure for the past 10 years doing this podcast and now our YouTube channel, sponsored by Wellington Square Bookshop. Today, our guests are Susan Shor Fehmi and Mark Beauregard, co-authors of The Open Focus Life, which will be published on July 20th, well, less than a week now, by Shambhala Publications, one of my favorite imprints. And I've actually been practicing Shambhala meditation, thanks to my brother, for almost half my life. Prior to this work, Les and Susan, and now Mark, wrote The Open Focus Brain and then Dissolving Pain with Jim Robbins, also available from Shambhala. Their clinic, with regard to this discipline, is in Princeton, New Jersey, where you can attend one of many workshops on brain synchrony as complemented by the Open Focus method and biofeedback. And there's lots of other ways you can access their work online at their website, which is simply Open Focus. The founder and driving force of the Open Focus method was Les Fehmi, whose life was celebrated on June 23rd. And thus, to our loss, he is not here to talk with us today. And perhaps we can use some of our time at the beginning to talk about him. So when I first heard of Open Focus, I was a bit perplexed because, you know, the Webster's definition of open or of focus is a point at which rays converge or from which they diverge. I always thought of it like the center of your interest or your observation. But I learned from reading this book that perhaps I was off a bit, or actually I was right. So it's still a bit of a conundrum to me. So let's get the real story about Open Focus. Thanks, Susan and Mark, for joining us today to talk about your new book and a little bit about the prior seminal books.
Great. Yes, Open Focus.
Thanks so much for having us.
You're welcome. Go ahead,
Open
Susan.
Focus was chosen as a way to describe the technique for the paradoxical nature of open and focus, because all the attentional styles at once are ideal. So it was meant to be paradoxical.
It's interesting because I end up talking about myself. Shut me up if I do. I was playing racquetball last night, and I thought racquetball, like, this is the perfect example because you're in a box. You are inside a box, so the volume's not like tennis or soccer. You are inside an actual box. And I started thinking about the technique and not where the ball was, but where my opponent was, the space between us, the space-time continuum. And I found that, no, it's like in your book. You don't brag about this. Things happen little by little. And as we entered our third game, I started thinking, well, I'm not worried about this. She's my friend. This is just fun. And like Zen archery, it became much more of just a pleasurable experience. And I actually did better. So that's my story.
Yes. And
can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
So when you were practicing Open Focus on the racquetball court, did you experience the space that you were in as filled? Because one of Les Fehmi's interesting observations is that there is no empty space. And this is something that's sort of commonsensical. Like the air, we know that the air is filled with molecules, and it will resist you in the wind. But going through everyday life, you don't often consider that you are part of space that is entirely filled. And when you move through space, you're displacing other space, and so you become a part of a continuum of the space all around you. And I play tennis, and when I've had that experience, the ball seems much slower because I'm appreciating the space that it's traveling through in a different way, in a more concrete way. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, for two reasons. My son could have been a professional tennis player and is right now in the regionals for the USTA. And we talked about this. And his problem, and he sees a sports psychologist, is that idea of not being able to, well, one, he focuses on the last point and the next point, which you talk about. But for me, last night, and again, I won't say it was a breakthrough, and you guys are good because you don't push that. You don't say, oh yeah, now she's doing the end caps perfectly, and now she loves her boss, and now it's a great store, or he loves living in LA. Really, he loves hating it so much, which is great because that's how I live. But not to digress, yeah, I began to feel like you were talking about in the book about archery, like the target, the arrow, me are basically just the same thing because we're all stuff as you go along the line. So that way, as an example, I started realizing I could hit balls low, like kill shots, which I actually couldn't do before because I was just kind of like saying, oh, there's the bottom of the space. Why don't I move to the bottom of the space? So yeah, kind of yes and no.
Yeah. I think one of Les's great contributions by monitoring his own brainwaves is discovering that the more you open up to space and merge with space, which is everywhere and runs through everything, and yet we forget about it, the more you do that and your attention broadens and becomes more immersed, the more your brainwaves change, the more the central nervous system changes, the more the autonomic nervous system changes and all the peripheral systems, and you begin to feel like a different person in this world. This cascade effect just by opening up to space. So it's so simple and so elegant. And in the other books, we talk in great detail about the science. But I think what's so great about this book is the way that Mark punctuated it with all these wonderful anecdotes and situations that we could all relate to.
Yeah, as I was saying, I mean, and you can tell when a book is good because you can remember kind of everything. Well, that's kind of open focus too when you read the book. And you talk about seeing the letters and feeling the paper and all that, but I can remember the NCAP, I can remember the SAT, I can remember the public speaking, I can remember moving to LA, I remember standing around the bed all holding hands and his feet. Why am I able, because of what I was, why am I able to do that with your book? You tell me.
Well, my answer is that the way you wrote it, Mark, you captivated me as the reader.
Well, I think, Sam, that it's because the situations that we portray in the book are so relatable. I mean, I almost feel like we should go back to brass tacks and sort of explain how we're thinking about attention differently. But just to answer your question, I really think, so the people, so the book is, it's about Les Fehmi's discoveries. So he spent 50 years in academia, doing peer-reviewed research that demonstrates the ways in which paying attention to space has beneficial physiological impacts. So when you use his methods, you calm down, you open up, and avenues for conflict resolution become more obvious than they had been before. So as you were saying, it's not a panacea. It doesn't solve everything. You're still going to have problems when you use his method, but using his method calms you down and allows you to see other people's points of view and gives you a different relationship with your own emotions so that you can process them in a more open and beneficial way. So in this book, we talk about the real life experiences of people who are having everyday problems that they can't quite figure out, and the ways in which paying attention in the way that Les discovered helps them. And you talked about the guy who moves to LA. So there's a story in there about this guy who, his wife gets a job in LA and he doesn't want to move there and he hates every second of it. And as he's focusing on his hatred of the city, and he can't move, like he emotionally is shut down. He doesn't know how to behave. But when he, instead of fighting that feeling of hatred, when he allows himself to kind of indulge in it and explore it and let it expand, he finds new ways to discover Los Angeles. Not new ways of liking it, although that happens too, but just new ways of interacting with it that are helpful, that don't keep him trapped, focused on the negative emotions that he has when he moves there. So I think that's the secret to this is the first couple of chapters are all about Les's work and how simple it is to apply in your everyday life. And then it's a million different examples of models that you can use to solve little problems that you're going to have every day, as we all do.
My favorite line of the book is, in that case, when he starts the open focus method, the sentence says, he realized he really, really hated it.
Me. Yes. Yeah, I met Les and was smitten immediately. And my mother always told me, if you want a man to like you, you have to show an interest in their work. So I was a therapist at a time. At the time, I was a talk therapist, and it was hard for me. I would say this is true, Mark, that most of the people we work with have an easy time, but I didn't. I didn't want to sit still. I didn't want to sit in my own in space. I wanted to keep my mind running. So it was very hard for me. I think the part of the book that I love so much is the everydayness of it. That Mark describes the situation when you're at the grocery store and you're on the express lane and you promise to be home in half an hour. And the man in front forgot his checkbook. The woman behind him has more things on the conveyor belt than she's supposed to have, and you're already late and you're in a snit. What do you do? And I love that, because that's what I think most of us experience, these moments of frustration, and there's not a thing you can do about it.
Yeah, and it's funny because yesterday the movers were here to move me to my new house, which my partner loves, and I love it too, but I've been here 20 years. My kids grew up here. When I go into Samantha's bedroom now, which is empty, I think of all the things that we did there, and I want to cry. But then I go back to the space-time continuum that you describe in the book, and I realize it's still all here. There's no difference. This is the same space it all happened in. So here it is. It's all still here. And rather than feeling sad about it, I should go, I was happy here. I can still be happy here. I don't have to miss or regret the fact that I'm not going to be in this particular space anymore.
Yes. To me, I think that the real value of Les's work is it came out of science. It came by observing brainwaves. And as we all know, brainwaves are a reflection of the nervous system, and the nervous system is an expression of how we're feeling and what's going on in our lives at any given moment. And he just distilled out of watching what changes brainwaves this idea that how you pay attention, not to what you pay attention, but how you pay attention, orchestrates the whole thing. So if you're in, as Mark said, in narrow focus and avoiding something, your body is in over arousal and everything seems overwhelming. But as soon as you diffuse and enter into space, everything normalizes, everything calms down. And it's so simple, and yet it came out of this science, which we attempt to talk about in a very brief way. The other two books are more technical. This is intended as an everyday kind of primer.
That was an interesting discussion of that, because how did you correlate, or I guess come together, Mark, with the idea that, as Susan said, this is a very science-based, empirical type of work, and yet your book, both of your book, concentrates on, like you said, these day-to-day examples, but it's still based on science. And how did you, put those two together when you were working on the book?
Well, that's a great question, because I'm still not sure that I can talk about the science in a way that would make neuroscientists happy. So I read all of Les's work and kind of was just thrown into the deep end and learned to swim in the kinds of discoveries that he was making starting in the 1960s. And so that study was really important to understand the basics of it, but I come at this as a non-scientist, and things really turned for me when I met Les. Susan and Les invited me to their lab at Princeton, and they put me through an open focus workshop. And then I began to see the technical details in practice. And once I saw how you could use the very technical things that Les discovered so simply, and in my everyday life, things really opened up for me. And I actually want to go back to your experience of moving, because that to me is a really important shift that happened for me as well. So when you're having a happy experience, you can just be completely immersed in it, and you're enjoying it. You're physiologically, your systems are all aligned, your brain waves are aligned and in synchrony, and you don't try to grasp onto that experience. You don't think, oh, I'm having a happy experience, I have to preserve this happy experience, I have to objectify this happy experience so that I can enjoy it more. You're just in it. And what happens when we have negative experiences is we don't want to make them part of ourselves. We want them to be, something separate, something we don't even have to go through maybe. And so we objectify it, and we make these negative emotions something separate from ourselves. And that means that we stay stuck in them, because it's the same way when you're happy, the event, you're enjoying the event, and then it ends, and then you let it go, and something else happens to come up to replace it. If you do that with a negative event, the same thing will happen. So instead of holding on to it or hating it or whatever emotion you're having, if you just emerge into the emotion, just let it take you over the way you would a happy emotion, then it will pass, you'll process it, and then the next thing will come up, just as when you're happy. So that kind of experience really was the key that unlocked Les's work. So, again, if you ask me a very technical question about neurobiology, I'm going to have to refer to one of Les's papers. But just in my own experience, the application of that neurobiology makes me calmer and allows me not to hold on to negative experiences.
Well, this is a very personal question, Susan, but since Les has only been gone for basically exactly 3 weeks,
Yes.
how have you used his science and yours and your experience to cope and to understand what happened?
Well, I do. As he was passing, I was doing it all along. But when I'm feeling my grief and my loss, I merge with it instead of trying to distract myself with activities, or even sometimes crying can be like a distraction. I just sit and I merge with those feelings, and I open up to space, and the feelings are there, but it feels more bearable. And it's we're not saying that you're not going to have emotions, but we make emotions worse when we try to avoid it. So I use the open focus every day. And I'm also doing this work by talking to people about his work, which I think is so groundbreaking. I think it's so important. And it's just a privilege for me to talk about it. But it's the diffusion of attention into space and the merging with feelings changes how you feel about everything.
Well, we touched on this a little bit, Mark, but I've talked to some people about the book because it's exciting, and at my bookstore it'll be on the front table, and there'll probably be one of our book clubs will, in all likelihood, discuss it. I call our book clubs Fight Club, because everybody, I feel like they're going to reach across the table and start hitting each other. But yeah, so when I talk to these other people about it, some of them are going, well, what good is this? She still is working in the store. She doesn't like the boss. What good is this? The guy is living in a place he hates. He misses St. Louis. It was pastoral. It was nice. He had all his friends. So what good is this that he's doing this? And I try to explain it the best I can, but maybe you're the best person to explain it.
Well, the reason why changing the way you pay attention to negative things is good is because you can't control everything in your life. We don't live in a world where all of our dreams come true. And there are sometimes things that you just can't change. In the example of the gentleman who moves to Los Angeles, his wife is a minister, and she gets appointed to a church in Los Angeles, and they've agreed that they talk through it, and they've agreed that it's a good opportunity for her. He loves her and wants to support her. They have a family they want to raise. They decide as a family that they're going to move to Los Angeles, and then he hates it. And he knows he hates it from the beginning. But there are reasons why you do things that you don't necessarily like personally. And there are reasons why you get sort of stuck in situations that you can't get out of. I mean, a lot of us have jobs that are not the ideal job, or we live in a place that for whatever I mean, the pandemic is a perfect example of this. Nobody can go outside. You can't, like, your movements are restricted, your health is at risk. So what good is it? Well, you can't just go out and, like, you're a danger to public health if you just behave in the way that you want to. So how do you take all those feelings, those negative emotions that you have, and transform them and live a calmer life within the parameters that you're given? And I think that's the real use of the open focus method, is that it's not settling or reconciling to negative things. We still encourage everyone to make changes when they can, but sometimes just like not getting stuck in those negative feelings that you have can open up possibilities for change. So if you're just focusing on how much you hate LA all the time, it may not be possible to see the aspects of LA that you might enjoy, or it may not be possible to see 3 years from now, you could be thinking about living somewhere else, and you could be enjoying life in the meantime in a different way. So I think about, so I'm just processing Les's passing myself, and I think about the ways in which he dealt with his illness. So we're all going to die in some way, and sometimes it's going to be slow and painful, and that's another thing that you can't escape. But you can deal with it in a different way based on how you pay attention. I think that's the value of Les's discoveries.
I think that the real, my story was as a psychotherapist, where I was trained to believe that once you uncover unconscious feelings and thoughts, and you bring it to the surface, you can then work it through, and you can understand how repressed feelings are driving your behavior and change those behaviors. But you're still left with residual feelings. Even Freud said you're left with common everyday miseries. I saw open focus as something that could take you to the next step, so that you're not feeling overburdened with these common miseries. And when I taught it, I would teach therapy. I would work with people who wanted therapy using traditional talk therapy, and then open focus for people who wanted that. But it became clear to me that they're intertwined. How you pay attention dictates what comes up for you. How do you respond to things? And it was towards the end that I started applying my compulsive eating, having been a compulsive eater all my life. And I've been in therapy up the wazoo. I understand how I got to be this way, why I do it, what my familial circumstances were, what my areas of the difficult times are for me. And when I started applying open focus, I discovered that I could dissolve these feelings. I could dissolve the desire to binge. I could dissolve the desire to eat too fast. I could dissolve my anxiety about not getting enough food if we had to share food. And I realized it went beyond my storyline. Therapy is often about our stories, and we all have our stories of what has made us the way we are, and we try to adapt and use more adaptive mechanisms. But this took it to the final step for me, and it allowed me to deal with it in a way that therapy never could.
What about another thing, that playing devil's advocate, I guess, Susan, is what about those people that, or what I said earlier about focus, say a diamond cutter or a calligrapher or a tightrope walker? The response people give me is, how you can't open your focus, because if you do, you're going to fall. You're going to make a mistake writing, or you're going to chip the diamond in the wrong way. How do you respond to that?
Oh, that's a great question. And it brings us back to the paradox of the phrase open focus, that if you are attending to something in a very narrow way, you're working on the ring and you're chipping away the diamond, and you're narrow focused on that, and to the exclusion of everything else, your whole body is tense. There's a nervousness that you experience. As soon as you start opening up around it with a central focus, everything normalizes, and it's much easier for you to do a more delicate task. In one of the books, a karate expert talks about when he's preparing in karate, your first stance is one in which is very much that way. You're open to everything. There's a 360-degree awareness of space and the objects around you. At the moment of action, you then narrow focus and then burst back into open focus. So that we talk about open focus as if we want you to move from narrow, effortful attention to this nice expanded state, but really they can all coexist at once. So anybody who's watching me and listening to me might notice they're narrow focusing on me and what I'm saying to the exclusion of everything else. But if they open up to space and open up to their own experience and keep me at the center of their awareness, they still get everything. They're not losing anything, but everything starts to normalize in the body. So we can have a center, narrow focus in an expanse of open focus.
It's funny.
I'm sorry, athletes know that. We work a lot with athletes and performers, and you know that you're singing in opera, and you better know the words, and you better know the music, or you're on a football field. You better know the signs and where you're going.
Yeah, it's funny. You know how they always say enjoy every moment. Well, I try to, but it only happens like 3 or 4 times a day. But when I used to be a trial lawyer, I remember one specific situation where I was cross-examining a physician expert who was a real jackass. And I knew I had him. Because he had taken his deposition, he said something, and now he's saying the opposite. And there was this moment of like the guy whose last name I can't pronounce, who wrote the book Flow.
Sent me high. Yes.
Yeah. And all of a sudden, I wasn't even there anymore. It was just a process because I knew everything that was going to happen. So it was almost as if I was, and I guess you've discussed this with people, it was almost as if I was back there somewhere in the courtroom or on the ceiling, looking down at the scene that was going on. And it was just, yeah, I can't say it was a perfect moment, but it was a unique moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So
yes.
I don't know if there's a response necessary, but that's just what happened to me.
Well, I'd actually, yeah, I'm sorry. And I think my internet connection is a little bit unstable, so it's like listening to a jammed Soviet radio station. So pardon me if I talk over you. But there's a way in which, I'm starting to stumble right now because I'm paying attention to what I'm saying. And so I don't know exactly what I'm going to, so you guys don't know what I'm going to say. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to say in a kind of word by word plan. Like we don't, I think this speaks to your experience of mastery in the courtroom, and it speaks to our everyday experiences. You know, it's a little bit less elevated when you're just, you know, talking to somebody in a cafe than when you're arguing in front of a judge. But the experience could be similar. So I'm talking now, I don't know exactly what I'm going to say. I don't have conscious control over everything all the time. Like we like to think that we're, you know, in control of more things than we actually are. What we are in control of, so you know, I'm breathing, I'm speaking, all these things are happening, you know, in our bodies that are going on below our conscious control. Even our thoughts are in a way, you know, emerge from something that's unconscious. What you can pay attention to, though, is your attention. You can attend to attention. And that kind of consciousness of how you're paying attention, more than, as Susan said, more than what you're paying attention to, can release that mastery that you've attained. So if you're worried about the arguments, or you're worried about the technical aspects of the law, and you haven't quite put it all together, then you may be thinking about that. You may be attending to that lack or that need that you have, you know, for framing the argument. But if you've done the work to put yourself in a position to know the law and to understand how it's being argued so that you can, you know, get this guy, then when your attention can shift, it can open, and you, like you said, like you can feel the entire courtroom, because that work that you did is in place, and you can trust that, and you can attend to things that are broader. You can open up instead of just being so narrowly focused on that one individual thing that you might get lost. You know, you might get lost in the argument or the courtroom, or somebody might get you because you fumble an argument or whatever. But when you can attend in this way in your everyday life, you can learn the law better, you can remember it better, and then when you're called to perform, you can perform in a more open way.
Yeah, it reminds me of, and Susan, you touched on this, sometimes I find in life that the easiest things to do are really the hardest things to do. But it's like taking that first step. It's like when I read one of Tangyong Trungpa's book about, jumping out of an airplane, and on the way down, just kind of letting go of the line of your parachute, just as he says, letting go of this little thingy. And it's the easiest thing to do, but it's also the hardest thing to do. And so you tell me, because I think you did say something about it, the easiness of it. But the easiest things sometimes I find are very difficult.
I find that it's hard to remember to do it. I'll be in the morning, I'm sort of on the OCD end of the spectrum, and I'm straightening things up, and I'm taking a dirty coffee cup from the bedroom into the sink. And you would think I was carrying on an emergency. The seriousness with which I do it. And as soon as I feel that feeling, I know I'm in narrow focus, and I immediately open up into space. And I'm still walking into the kitchen with the same pace, and I'm still holding this coffee cup, but it's not an emergency anymore. And so for me, it's remembering to do it. It's reminding myself to do it. Now, I think performers and athletes spend so much time being aware of these factors that they do it much more routinely. But most of us have been trained to be narrow focused. We were born into this world, and we had to figure out what was us and what was the rest of the world. And then we got rewarded for this kind of attention, and we got over habituated to this narrow focus. And that's where we return to. So
yeah. And I think that between Robert and your contributions to this book, I think the complementary aspect of it really helps. And so, yeah, I would recommend to people, I guess, in conclusion, that definitely read The Open Focus Life, and then you'll be interested in it, and then certainly can go back to The Open Focus Brain and Dissolving Pain. And I guess in conclusion, Susan, why don't you tell us a little bit about Princeton and the many different ways people can access your process and your seminars and things like that online and all that kind of stuff. And then we'll close it out.
Well, openfocus.com is our website, and it contains everything. We certainly have a practice in which people come in and practice open focus, and they can also ride the EEG equipment, so their brain waves are being monitored at the same time they're practicing open focus. We do Zoom sessions, we do workshops in which people come for a 3-day period learning about open focus and the equipment. And we do just traditional psychology, teaching people how to open their focus. And all the books and the peer-reviewed papers are on the website. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody, either by email or on the phone. It's Susan@openfocus.com. I'm a fast responder to emails.
Great. Yeah. Well, so as I said, I definitely recommend Open Focus Brain. As I said, you'll probably be getting calls because since people will be buying it at the bookstore, I'm sure they'll be interested in following up. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Susan, very much for joining us today. This was a great conversation. And as you can tell, the book actually affected me, and I'm actually, whether I'm doing it on purpose or not, I'm actually working with it. So thanks so much to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
See you guys later. So long.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.